Daniel Morales from howtojapanese.com, and it's August 2025. We made it. Otsukare-sama deshita. It is toasty out there, so I hope everyone is keeping cool. We had a 1 week stretch at some point in August here in Osaka when it rained and kind of kept the temperature down to highs of around 30 or 31, but now it's back to 35, 36, and it seems like it's going to be this way through September at least. So do what you need to do to keep cool. I went for a run the other night and it was like 30 degrees at 9 p.m. So we're in the worst of it. And one thing that we do once a year is splurge on a really nice kakigori. A lot of these gourmet kakigori places seem to have opened up in Japan over the past 10, 15 years or so. And the Google Trends data for this is super interesting. I kind of ran into it this month, so I'll share an image of that on the blog. Go take a look. But essentially, searches for kakigori peak in the summer, so you get a very distinct wave-like peaks and troughs kind of image. But it also shows a more gradual rise in interest over time from about 2010 onward, which jives with my own lived experience in Japan. Kakigori, I'm sure, have been around forever, probably since ice was invented. Mostly as festival foods, shaved ice with flavored syrup, very simple kind of dessert that we eat around the world. It's not that special. We had snowballs growing up in New Orleans. And I remember having my first kakigori in Japan in 2002, which was the first summer I visited Japan. It was a really small one. It was pretty basic. It was nice, though. It wasn't just kind of like a blue colored one from a festival. I remember it was kind of a small bowl and had, I think, some azuki and cream and maybe a little matcha. And strangely enough, it was at Kiyomizu-dera. On my first week here in Japan, I was taken there by my tantosha at the internship where I was. So, but now you have these kind of gourmet kakigori places that serve up these like massive balloon-sized desserts that look like works of art. And I think they're kind of fundamentally different from what kakigori used to be. So there's one place that we like to go to every year and splurge on these because they're not cheap. The one where we go, it's not a kakigori specialty restaurant, but rather a little cafe that happens to have nice kakigori in addition to sandwiches and coffee. And it doesn't have massive lines. It hasn't been discovered by the tourists, but it is a local spot, so you do have to wait usually. It's not something you can kind of just stroll into. We got the peach kakigori. That's our typical order. They don't do anything super fancy, but they have nice fruit kakigori, which are kind of like layered with a wall of peaches or pineapple on the outside. And they run 3,000 yen, so it's a once-a-year treat for us. And man, is it good. It will really cool you down. It's just a perfect summer dessert. But I don't recommend having it on an empty stomach. I find that they're really insubstantial. Despite their size, it's really kind of deceptive because it's just sugar and water essentially. So I always try and have some kind of like sandwich beforehand. So that's my recommendation for keeping cool this summer. Go to Dotor, pick up a small sandwich and maybe an iced latte, and then have a nice kakigori. Back to the core of the content this month, and there are a couple changes. I've shifted the newsletter off Substack and onto Ghost. And if you're not familiar with Ghost, it's an open source newsletter/blog platform. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. I think it was 6 months ago in February that I kind of asked everyone for their feedback to see what you thought. And it's a little bit more complicated than I expected. I've always been more of a rent the space on the platform kind of person, and Substack has moved away more and more from that into a kind of social media presence that I'm not totally comfortable with for the same reason that a lot of people have shifted off the platform, although I am kind of dismayed at the number of people who are remaining on Substack. As I mentioned, setting up Ghost really felt daunting. When I set up my WordPress, it really did feel as simple as getting a server and putting some files on it and then being able to run them. And I think that's essentially what Ghost is to a certain extent, except it involves the command line and it involves a lot more manual kind of setting up ports and things like that and getting different pieces of software to communicate with each other, and other accounts and things like that. So I've gone with a managed host at the moment that seems to have great support and also very explicit terms of use policy about hate speech. With Ghost, I'll also be able to pick up and leave to a fully self-hosted server if I ever need to or want to or am able to. It's something I'd like to do eventually, but I really need to do some studying and prep before I do that. And I'm in the midst of trying to learn about Docker at the moment, which is currently the newest way that you can install Ghost and the way that they recommend installing it with their 6.0 release, which includes some interesting Activity Hub and social features. The more I look into it, the more complicated it gets. So if anybody has any resources that they recommend looking at, I'd love to see them. Please do send it my way. For readers, it should mostly be a seamless experience. You can find the new newsletter at newsletter.howtojapanese.com. I sent out a final Substack newsletter yesterday, letting everyone know. And then today, the next day, basically right after I record this podcast and upload it, I'm going to send out my standard monthly newsletter via Ghost. I wasn't sure how I wanted to handle my Substack archive. I hate to just delete it all because it's something I did create and it was out there. And also it would risk, I think, potentially somebody using the How to Japanese name on Substack. It is possible to import content from Substack to Ghost, but currently comments cannot be exported. I wrote on Substack for just about 2 years before getting my first comment, and I still only get a few comments here and there. But I do think that I would like for those to kind of remain as they are. I had some nice interactions and some good questions, and I really valued that. So I'll probably just kind of roll up the shutter and leave things as they are. I wish there was a way to kind of like turn it all into like a static site of some sort, but I don't know if that's possible. I've downloaded all my data so I can import if I need to in the future. And I think leaving it online will also be a good way to ensure that I can import it, because downloading your data gets certain parts of your Substack able to import into Ghost, but you would need everything online to be able to grab all the images and everything else like that. So yeah, I think I'll leave it for now. And if the comments ever do become exportable, then I think I probably would look into getting everything off of Substack and then onto Ghost. I does feel like they're kind of trying to lock people into the Substack universe at the moment, though, and turn it into a kind of all-encompassing social experience. Ghost, on the other hand, is now connected with the Fediverse and Mastodon and things like that, places like that. So I'm still going to be figuring out how that works, and we'll see. As I mentioned, I'm on a managed host. It's called Magic Pages for now. If anybody's looking for a similar situation, I went with them in part because the guy who runs it, his name is Giannis. He responded to a number of my questions on Reddit about how to run Ghost from a self-hosted installation on another service. I was looking into either PikaPods or DigitalOcean, which both seem pretty promising and not too difficult. He didn't actively plug his service, Magic Pages, which was nice. He instead responded to my questions and gave me some pretty good advice, which is basically to try and use the simplest solution possible, given my experience level. So we'll see how things go. Hope you don't mind me bringing you all along with me with the Switch. Hope you don't mind the Switch. Hopefully it won't cause any issues. I believe you may have to respond to an email prompt if you're commenting for the first time, but you should be in the system as someone who's able to comment on the newsletters. Speaking of the newsletter, this month I wrote about a topic that was one of the very first topics I ever wrote about on howtojapanese.com way back in 2008. How do you report someone's speech in Japanese? How do you convey information from one person to another person? This, I think, is such an interesting topic because it's so fundamentally different from the way you do it in English. In English, we explicitly name each party involved in conveying the information. She told me X. He told me Y. We do have a few convenient phrases that can mark information as reported information, such as reportedly, supposedly, apparently. These all, I think, are maybe closer to kind of structurally what the Japanese looks like, but the he said, she said is actually how the Japanese patterns function. So it's very different. Japanese functions without any stated subjects. In my original blog post, I highlighted the phrase "so desu." All you have to do is attach this to the end of a direct style phrase in Japanese, and instantly the information becomes reported information. There's no pronouns required. The work of establishing context, however, is up to you in the previous sentences, and that context is what makes it possible to not use sentences. So, for example, if someone told you that the Hanshin Tigers had won a baseball game, you can communicate that simply by saying, Hanshin ga katta sou desu. Hanshin ga katta sou desu. So the phrase there is Hanshin ga katta. That's the basic information. That's a direct style, right? The distal style would be Hanshin ga kachimashita. Hanshin ga kachimashita. Hanshin ga katta that's your information. Hanshin won. You attach sou desu onto the end of that. Hanshin ga katta sou desu. And you've communicated that information. Someone has said this to you, and now you're passing it on. But you would want to do that work of establishing the context immediately before this with something like, お姉さんが野球を見に行ってきました. I'll say that again. お姉さんが野球を見に行ってきました. Which means my older sister went to see a baseball game. And now that you've established that context, you know, okay, this person's sister went to see a baseball game. You wouldn't need to restate the sister in that sentence. 阪神が勝ったそうです。お姉さんが野球を見に行ってきました。阪神が勝ったそうです。So my older sister went to see went to see a baseball game. Hanshin won. I heard that Hanshin won. She said that Hanshin won is literally what that means. And we know, because of that context, we know who went to see the baseball game, and we're following it up immediately with that reported information. So that's what I wrote about 17 years ago. This month, I wrote about the pattern ということです. ということです, which functions mostly in the same way. You just attach it to the end of a direct style phrase, and then you've passed on the information, including kind of who said it, the implication that someone said this to you. 阪神が勝ったということです. That's how it would sound. So you could say, 阪神が勝ったそうです, or you could say 阪神が勝ったということです. This pattern was re-emphasized to me during my year at IUC a couple years back, and I was recently reminded of it when I was reading the book I mentioned on the podcast back in February, 最長片道切符の旅. 最長片道切符の旅, which is a mouthful, and in English it translates to the longest one-way train ticket journey. And the writer is a man named Miyawaki Shunzo. I'm still reading it in kind of dribs and drabs here and there. It's kind of my lunchtime book at work, and whenever I can make time for it in between reading Roberto Bolaño and Osamu Tezuka's Buddha manga. They didn't write that together. I'm reading a Roberto Bolaño novel and Osamu Tezuka manga, although now I have this amazing idea that somewhere in some universe, Roberto Bolaño and Osamu Tezuka are collaborating on some insane manga, which would be incredible. But I'm only, the first few days into Miyawaki's journey, and so he's still in Hokkaido as he ventures on his way south from Hokkaido all the way down to Kyushu. And you really get a good sense of who Miyawaki is as a person. He generally starts on the first train of the day at 5 or 6 in the morning, and he's often starving because I don't think he's eating breakfast, and there aren't always bento for sale at some of the small stations that he's passing through. It doesn't seem like he's booking his accommodation in advance. He's often kind of letting himself go with the flow, even though he does have a definite schedule. He will often kind of pause that and do like a side quest and go off on a little train line that One I think he mentioned is at that time of writing had the lowest profits. I think it was probably running in the red some of these train lines, and so he wasn't sure if he would be able to ride it ever again. So he literally stops at some train station, takes a 20-minute ride to the end of this little tiny train line, hops right back on and goes right back to that juncture that he started from, and is back on his longest one-way train ticket journey. So he's doing side quests. He's staying at these random hotels. He ends up doing laundry in hotel bathrooms and hanging clothes to dry. It is the fall, so there are heaters on in the places where he's staying, but his clothes don't completely dry, so he's kind of starting in these slightly damp clothes and drying out over the course of the day. So you get little funny details like that. He's also got lots of commentary about the natural environment, mountains, trees, lakes, things that he's passing by. He must have brought a couple different like maps and almanacs or something with him, because he's like looking at mountain ranges to confirm things and things like that. And so the phrase that reminded me of toいうことです comes on, I think, his third day on October 15th, 1978. He's traveling from Nemuro to Monbetsu, and he's kind of on the lookout for shirakaba, which is a type of tree called the Japanese white birch. I can't remember exactly why, but he steps out onto the platform at Kerochi Station and asks the conductor if the trees that he sees near the tracks are shirakaba, white birch, which they are not. He gets back on the train, and then a few stops later, there's all these kind of like very small, like temporary stops, not full stations. And at one of them, there's a very funny passage as an old woman in red sweatpants gets on, smelling what he calls namagusai, so fishy. Miyawaki is intrigued by this smell and notes that it isn't entirely unpleasant, that it actually makes him hungry for oysters. So much so that he wants to ask her why she smells that way, which leads to this very funny sentence, which I'll try and read out. しかし、あなたはなぜ生臭いのかと尋ねるわけにもいかない。I'll read that one more time. しかし、あなたはなぜ生臭いのかと尋ねるわけにもいかない。However, I can't very well ask this woman, why do you smell fishy? So he sits there with this fishy woman in front of him. The train passes Lake Saroma and pulls into Baro Station, and Miyawaki again sees some trees that he thinks are white birch, which gives him the opportunity to strike up a conversation with the woman. I assume he asks her what they are, and this is where he uses the written form of toいうことです to convey her response to the reader. So he implies that he asks her what the trees are, and then he gives, so he says, 私は生臭いおばあさんに尋ねた。私は生臭いおばあさんに尋ねた。And the next sentence is, やはり白樺で、この辺りではガンピとも言うとのことであった。I'll say that one more time. やはり白樺で、この辺りではガンピとも言うとのことであった。So this is another perfect example. In that first sentence I read, 私は生臭いおばあさんに尋ねた. We get the context. So he asks this woman, the fishy woman. So we know who's involved in this transfer of information. Miyawaki, the watashi, and then this namagusai oba-san, this fishy woman. And so any information that's relayed is going to be between these two, and then Miyawaki will then relay it to the reader. So he sets up the context. He gives the information that was relayed, right, which is yahari shirakaba de. Although yahari there is coming from Miyawaki's point of view, right? It's yahari to him. It is meeting his expectations that it was shirakaba. And then I think the information that's passed on is この辺りではガンピとも言う。この辺りではガンピとも言う, which is in this area they also call the shirakaba gampi. And I looked that up. That's on Wikipedia apparently. It's called gampi. I've never Never heard of it. But that's the information that's conveyed. この辺りでは元否とも言う. And then he marks it with the phrase that signals that it's reported information that's being conveyed from the woman to him and then on to the reader. とのことであった, which is とのことだ, or the past tense of とのことだ or である. So yeah, this passage reminded me of how convenient this little phrase is and how you can use this structure very easily. I feel like I use it all the time in work situations where I need to pass on information from one group of people to another. You can also use it in both written or spoken Japanese. I think if you're using it in spoken Japanese, I would say ということです, ということです. But if you need to sound slightly more formal, you could say とのことです, とのこと. ということです is probably more natural, I would say. But とのことです could probably be used in the right situation in spoken Japanese. Over on the blog, howtojapanese.com, I stumbled on a Yahoo Chiebukuro post where someone asked about the difference between so desu and ということです. And the responses are pretty interesting. There's a wide variety of responses. I recommend going over and reading it. Check the blog for the link to that. The gold medal award gives the basic summary, but there's some interesting other replies as well. The general response seems to be that ということです is used to convey kind of unvarnished information. It's more of a direct, impartial quote, just kind of passing on the information with no judgment about it as to whether or not it's true or something or false. It's just something that's been heard and then conveyed. And then the so desu is used to pass on information that has been confirmed, refined, or focused by the listener, and so would be maybe considered to be more objectively true, I guess, maybe potentially. I wouldn't think about it in this much depth. Potentially, I would say you could use either of these, but maybe good to remember that ということです is good if you really just need to pass on a direct message. And that's the core of the newsletter content, the new newsletter content, newsletter.howtojapanese.com. Give it a look. I'm glad to start on this note. I had a couple other newsletters that I'm in the process of drafting, some that I thought I was going to be using, and then I read this passage from Miyawaki, and I was like, okay, this is it this month. And then it just kind of conveniently, I had written about it, 2008, one of the first couple posts on the blog, howtojapanese.com. And so I'm glad that I can start the new newsletter there. It seems like a fitting spot. It's ultimately something that I think never ends when you're studying Japanese, which is trying to figure out the most natural way to say something. I feel like I'm learning things all the time, every day. I've gotten a handle on how to convey information, but there's so many other places where I need to improve. I feel that super keenly. And I think you only do that through repetition. So get those opportunities where you can. In the Iroiro section of the newsletter this month, I have a handful of links. There was a really interesting Mainichi Shimbun op-ed about Prime Minister Ishiba's speech commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. He used the word hansei, which is reflection, regret, remorse, kind of somewhere triangulated between those three meanings. He used that in his remarks for the first time since 2013. It had, I guess, been kind of phased out during the Abe years. So the op-ed praised him for that, but also kind of was somewhat critical about not going a little bit further to recognize Japan's role in the war. Definitely worth giving that a read. Super, super interesting and timely, relevant. I've also got a couple interesting TikTok links as usual. One is my Slow Japanese podcast. I've been wanting to recommend this podcast for a while now, but I was waiting to see if Uyo, the guy who runs it, I assume that's it. I think that's his name. That's the name he posts under on TikTok. I was waiting to see if he was going to post the podcast frequently enough for these to be a good recommendation, because I know not everybody is on TikTok quite as much as I am. I discovered his account on TikTok, and he gives these short little posts where he talks very slowly about a topic and includes both Japanese and English subtitles. Some of his content he also puts on his podcast feed, but it seemed like the podcast feed was a little dormant for a while, but it's starting to kind of come back online. And I do feel like it would be really useful for a lot of beginner and advanced beginner intermediate kind of level students. I highly recommend listening if you're trying to increase your listening practice but are having trouble finding the right kind of content, or if you're finding content specifically that is too fast or too complicated. This is the right stuff for you. It's also great because you're truly practicing your listening skills, but he also has a transcript in the podcast notes if you want to read along. And again, it's another great reason that you can make TikTok into a Japanese learning app for you. If you got on TikTok and only followed the accounts that were Japanese study accounts, you wouldn't have to use your For You page. You could go over to the accounts you're following, and then every video you saw would be some sort of Japanese study. That, I think, would be a really excellent way to kind of force yourself to do a little bit more Japanese study, even if it's just in short hits here and there. When I was preparing for the podcast, the latest video happened to be about not saying and so, which I think is a really good topic. One that I think a lot of students fall into, a trap that a lot of students fall into. I hear it around me all the time. I'll put a link to it in the newsletter this month, so look at the bottom of the newsletter for that. Yeah, they're really bad habits, and it's something that you kind of have to be really conscious about in order to phase out of your active use. And Uyo points out that these phrases in particular may frustrate someone you're speaking with because it assumes that you don't want to hear what they have to say or something like that. So if you are trying to do an aizuchi, just say or hai rather than so. My recommendation, my podcast specific recommendation for the month is Open Air Brewing. Open Air is a Kobe-based brewery, and I think they are making some of the best beer in Japan these days. To be honest, I am not drinking quite as much as I used to in my 20s and 30s, but and so I don't really know exactly what's going on with the Japanese beer scene, especially around Tokyo, because we have enough here in Kansai. But Open Air, I think, is definitely one of the best in the Kansai region for sure. They make a lot of, I'd say they're the most American style brewery that I've seen in Japan in terms of their offering range. Their spectrum of beers they're offering is much closer to a American craft brewery than your classic Japanese craft brewer. They make a lot of hazy IPAs, also known as New England IPAs, because they all originated from Heady Topper, I believe, which is from Vermont. A beer that was so hoppy and hazy that the brewery encouraged drinkers to drink it straight from a can when it first started coming out, because this was a new style that people weren't ready for. They weren't kind of used to this opaque beer that they were making. I never really kind of fell in love with the style, even though there were a lot of great breweries in Chicago that were turning out some super fresh, super hoppy, juicy beers. I don't know. There were some decent beers, but nothing ever really struck me in the same way that the lagers and pale ales did there, not to mention the stouts. But I went to the Open Air tap room in Sannomiya last year, and everything we had there was just like outstanding, just super on point, balanced, hoppy, fruity, dank, not too strong. A lot of these New England IPAs are upwards of 7, 8, 9%. There's this kind of discount international shop right next to Seijo Ishii. I always forget the name of it at my local station, and they always have these canned beers, often from the name of the brewery is escaping me right now. I think it's a British brewery, but at any rate, they're generally about half off for some reason. I assume because they're close to the expiration date. But there were 3 when I checked this past time. There was like a double hazy, there was a hazy, and then there was one other beer, but they were all like 7, 8, 9%, which is that's like too much. That will like put me to sleep these days. Open Air, on the other hand, I think much more reasonable range. 6, 5.5 to 7% for the most part, and then they have a lot of other offerings. great stuff. This past week, the reason why I'm thinking about them is because I ordered a couple gifts for friends and had them shipped. The beer arrived overnight. I put in the order on the weekend. It shipped Monday. It arrived Tuesday, and I think the order I had sent to Tokyo was shipped cold, so it arrived like ready to drink. The cost ends up being somewhere around 700 to 800 yen a can if you include shipping, which I think is not terrible value for what you're getting. Again, I'm not drinking too much these days, but most of the time I'll just take a fresh Japanese macro lager right off the shelf for 250, 300 yen. That's perfectly fine for me. Every now and then it's nice to try something new. So I will definitely kind of keep this in mind for myself as well. Right now, Open Air has a watermelon goes that looks super tasty and I think would be probably a perfect summer beer. So give Open Air a try if you're looking for some solid brews, if you live in Japan and want to treat yourself. And that's all the Iro I have for you this month. One final note is that September is my annual Murakami month, Murakami Fest, I call it. So over on howtojapanese.com, I'll have a new post each week looking at Murakami's travel memoir, Distant Drums, when he lived in Europe for 3 years. There's some really interesting sections this time around. Murakami is in Italy and London, writing Dance, 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 going to classical music concerts, seeing movies. So you get this very interesting, strange look at pop culture and high culture through the lens of Murakami, both with his wife and on his own when he's in London. So pretty interesting stuff. Check that out on howtojapanese.com starting on September 1st. And that's all I have for you this month. We'll see you in September when hopefully, fingers crossed, it's a little cooler than it is now.